When you're talking about the area of leadership development, there's no shortage of conceptual material. But what can be hard to find sometimes is some good practical tools, ones that you can actually use with various leaders of different cultures and all types of different circumstances. Well, that's what we have for you today. It's a dialogue tool called Dress Codes, and the man who created it is here with us today to share about how we can use it and how powerful it is in seeing leaders developed. So stay tuned. Welcome to the Field Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Bob McNabb, and with me today I have my co-host, Scott Lundy, who lives and leads in the Middle East. And our special guest is Henry Clay. We've asked Henry because he has developed a very helpful developmental tool that we would like for him to explain and share with you, and hopefully, team leaders, something that you could put in your tool belt and help you take your leadership and leader development to the next level.
I'm excited today because our guest, Henry Clay, is someone who I've first started hearing about in 2009, and I eventually met him in 2018. Since then, Henry's become a dear friend and a great mentor for me. Henry has spent 47 years in full-time ministry with the Navigators, and 17 years of those 47 years have been in a cross-cultural context in Latin America. So Henry's got not just understanding of how to do leader development in the Western context, but also in the Latin American context. So we're glad to have you today, Henry.
Great to be with you. Thanks, Scott. Bob.
Henry, today we're going to be talking about developmental dialogues. Why is that significant, or what's important about developmental dialogues?
Why don't we pull back a minute and put it in its larger context of the Lead, Develop, Care framework? A lot of people end up in leadership because they're actually good at getting people to get things done. And the lead component is often a natural strength or a draw. They often have a care component because they like people, particularly when you're talking ministry. Often an area that's underdeveloped is being developmental in your thinking. Many leaders, actually some of our better leaders, feel a little bit caught flat-footed in the area of development. It's like, well, what do you do? I mean, I guess we could give them a course or read this book together, or if there's something that really bugs me about this person, I guess I'll go ahead and bring it up. But their whole concept of development is quite limited, and they feel it as well. And that results in them not doing it very much. And even when they do it, feeling like, is this what I ought to be doing? So one of the most powerful things to leverage that's immediately within the reach of even leaders that feel very weak in development is to make the most of the person's experience, what they're learning from by their experience. And someone has said, experience is the best teacher. My mentor, Paul Stanley, said, well, actually, experience is not the best teacher. Evaluated experience is. And frankly, if a person can stop and get some introspection and evaluation based on what they've just experienced, particularly in their leadership, they can get smarter and they can get better. So the trying to leverage a person's experience rather than just a generic teaching, let's read a book on delegation and discuss it, by identifying a period of time or an activity that's been done and using good questions to have a conversation about that. A lot of times if a person just stops and thinks about it, they'll connect the dots and come up with some ideas about their growth and development. So there's the idea of being developmental in your leadership, making the most of a person's experiences, and supporting them in a conversation that helps them think through and evaluate what they've experienced for their own growth and development.
Wow, that's great. Bob, you've been in full-time ministry for close to 4 decades. What have been some things from your experience of how to develop people, or when you were developed, what do you think about developmental dialogues? What comes to mind?
Yeah, I was thinking about this actually this morning, thinking about how you really have to have both of these two components. One is courage. The other is a tool or some method or process. And so I'm glad we're talking about the tool today. But as far as courage, I think, again, all of us want to be liked. We're afraid of offending somebody. And oftentimes we hold back in the effort to be nice, we don't engage in the conversations. But nice is the enemy of growth, or nice is the enemy of better. And so it's really a kindness to engage in a conversation that might help somebody grow and help them become better. Because as they are growing and becoming better, they're going to be more fulfilled, more satisfied. They're going to be used more in the kingdom of God. They're going to be more of a blessing to the people around them. And so it's a tremendous kindness to be courageous, as hard as it is, and engage in developmental conversations. So, but then, like Henry said, sometimes you don't know, like, how do I go about this? So if you have a particular tool, like the one we're going to talk about today, that just becomes maybe standard operating procedure, and maybe it's less of a hurdle to get in those regular conversations. So I'm really excited about going through the dress codes tool today.
Great question for both of you, but I'll start with Henry. How did you come to personally embrace this concept of developmental dialogues, and then to have the motivation to try to create tools to help others? I mean, obviously there's some type of journey, and you've mentioned mentors like Paul Stanley.
15 years ago, I was in a set of meetings where Paul Stanley and Terry were originally presenting the Lead Develop Care model. They brought up this concept of developmental dialogue and had 4 or 5 questions. But they were really good questions. So I wrote them down and thought, it's hard to remember 4 or 5 questions, but that's really good. I talked with them further about it and realized there were actually more things they would ask before and after. I thought, this is really getting unwieldy. It's getting better and better and less rememberable. So finally, I had 10 different logical questions and steps that were very stimulating in conversation and a natural flow to those questions. But I thought, there's no way I can remember 10 questions, maybe 2. And I just started playing with, was there any way to have a key word for each one, and ended up with an odd acrostic, because it has nothing to do with dress codes. It's just that it worked out. With that simple acrostic, describe, role, expectation, success, surprise, change, observation, development, execution, share. If I just wrote out dress codes, I knew all 10 questions in order. I thought, wow, I really like that. Well, actually, one of my applications from a seminar 15 years ago, is there any way to put this in a form that I could easily always remember it without having to look up anything? And I find that immediacy, particularly for a leader, to feel like you've always got that thing in your pocket that you could pull out anytime. You have control. If you only have time for 3 of the questions, you can do whatever you want. And so that really weaponized it for me by making it always memorable and therefore accessible. Yeah,
that's amazing. Great story. Bob, I know you're an intuitive thinker. When you're thinking of how to communicate things to people, sometimes I think of you as the mad professor in your office, like in the laboratory, coming up with ways. I know you like to come up with tools and processes as well. What was the turning point for you to realize that's the way you really want to apply yourself? Was it seeing a great need and some tools came about? Was it just speaking? Tell me a little bit about your journey to thinking about developmental dialogues and coming up with tools to help people.
I think for me, aha moment, Scott, was when I realized that God's wired me as a teacher, and some of the things that I do with people just come naturally, because that's how he's gifted me. And then I began to observe that others struggled with something. What do we do? How do we go about this? And so then I began to realize, what? To be reproducible, it would be helpful to try to create some tools that they could use and pass on. People over the years seem to have really appreciated that. People maybe with more of an evangelism gift or a gift of faith or serving. For those of us who are more teaching oriented, to package something in an easy pass-onable tool for them has really seemed to be a blessing to those that we've done that for.
Yeah, that's great. And I know it's been a blessing to me from both of you, the tools that you've created at different times. So we're talking about developmental dialogues. Henry, I'm curious, how would you define that, or what makes a dialogue developmental compared to maybe what's not developmental? Like, help us define this term, developmental dialogue.
In the Lead Develop Care model, we've got the sub-points of discover, teach, model, coach. Discover, what do they need development in? So picking a target, then teach, model, coach. And my bent had always been teach. I mean, I'm like you, Bob. I love making things clear, practical, but that just means you're monologuing. You're sharing pearls of wisdom. And so I did that for like 20, 30 years. In the second half of your career, you realize there's also a great power in interaction, dialogue, and a person's own self-discovery. And if you're doing all the talking, that doesn't play to that. I guess I worked with college students for 20 years, and since they're right at the beginning, they do need a lot of input. But once a person's 35 and up, there's a lot more benefit to be found by them connecting the dots. If you're a natural talker, teacher, find ways that help you facilitate their self-discovery without you doing all of the heavy lifting. That's where the developmental dialogue became so powerful for me, because it gave me a different way of approaching. Not that I always only do that, but I didn't have any way of doing it. I would ask a few questions, identify, I would start talking. So the developmental dialogue was really quite a revolutionary thought for me, that I can sit with a person and that my main contribution isn't new information, but asking questions that draw their attention to different aspects, and lights begin to go off in their mind, not because I turned on the lights. I just asked the questions, and their experience and their gifting combines with that, and they begin realizing things. And I can't make them realize it, but I can sort of set the table. But also your kind presence, listening and showing an interest, that's become somewhat of a lost art. When you do developmental dialogue, it really sticks out because most people don't listen. They're just waiting for their turn to talk. Giving the gift of yourself to someone for a period of time, not because you're trying to identify something specific, you're trying to help set the table where they can find whatever they need to find. There's a deep respect built into it for the person's journey and for the things they've already learned. It really is a different kind of a feel than teaching people the principles of parenting or whatever it is.
Yeah, that's great. We're talking about developmental dialogues, and we've mentioned this tool, and you actually hit the acrostic, but you went really fast. Would you just take a minute or two to slow it down a little bit for us and help us understand what each of those letters of dress codes mean and why it's important?
Great. So the first one is describe, and that's where you basically picking the right thing is often determinative on how well the conversation goes. It could be they had a fender bender yesterday. Well, that's not as helpful of a thing to do a dress codes on. It's just something that happened to you. It's not something you had put a lot of thought into. You just responded. You can do it, but let's just talk from a team leader's point of view. Some of the different kind of things you could do a dress codes conversation on is their first 6 months on the field, their first year as a team leader. It could be a project that they led. It could be their sabbatical, to think back over how that sabbatical went. Because they planned it, they carried it out. They now have the possibility of looking back on it and seeing what they learned from going through that experience. So the very first part is to describe it. Let's say Bob has a board of directors and he has a meeting with them, a 3-day meeting. Afterwards, I could say, Bob, tell me what you just did and how did it go? In other words, in 3 minutes, what would you say to your mom who said, well, how did the board meeting go? And says, well, we had a board meeting. It was 3 days in this place. I'd say it went pretty well because of this and that and the other. And just a quick description. What I have seen as a mistake is the person to drone on for an hour telling you every detail about this thing. You just want kind of a big picture. Describe it briefly. Then describe role. What was your part? What was the role that you played in that event? So in that case of a 3-day board meeting, well, he's the chairman of the board or he's the executive director. There is another chairman of the board. But actually, Bob was the one that had the agenda for the time, so that was his role. You don't always have to include that one, but sometimes it's a good thing to identify what was actually their task or responsibility in that setting. Expectation is the next one. How are you thinking it was going to go? As you were walking into that, were you confident? Were you expectant? Were you fearful? And they say, well, actually, I was a little bit nervous about doing this board meeting. Well, tell me about that. What was the cause of that anxiety? Why were you feeling that way? It depends on how much time you have. Normally, if you have a significant event or a period of time, you'd want to be able to take 30 minutes, maybe even a little bit more of time for this. And we can talk at another point in terms of how to set that up so the person feels safe and can fully engage without their defense shields up. So what were you expecting? What were you anticipating? What were you hoping would be outcomes? Describe, role, expectation. Now we're at success. This is probably my favorite question of the whole thing, because it's just a really good question, is what went well? And sometimes you're discussing something that overall went poorly. So it's very nice to not allow it to go immediately to what could be different or the pain points or disaster. There's almost always some things that went well, even if it's overshadowed by something else negative that happened. And so you say, what went well? Well, it was great to be together. We pretty much covered the agenda we had. I really felt like I came to a different level of trust with this particular board member. It was a beautiful venue. On some of the things, if they say, I felt like we were a lot more unified at that board meeting than we had been. And you can ask the follow-up question, what do you think contributed to that? What did you do that helped facilitate that? So you don't just say what went well, but you can do follow-up questions depending on their answers. And you really want this to be a good part of the developmental dialogue, because this is what, particularly if there's some pain points, this is what is carrying them emotionally through the rest of the developmental dialogue, because they're building on some things that did go well, that were successes, that you could feel good about. It's not all negative. And some people, if one thing's negative, it's all terrible. So you're trying to keep the emotional balance here by identifying and celebrating what went well and what was good, because they were in charge. I mean, credit is due. But it helps them to hear you celebrate what went well in this activity that they led. Describe, role, expectation, success. The next one is surprise. What caught you off guard? What were you not expecting? Obviously, you planned according to what you were thinking it was going to be, but there were certain things that you couldn't anticipate. Either somebody got sick in the middle of it and had to leave. What were the things that caught you off guard? This person's reaction on this particular subject totally hit me out of the blue. I had no idea they were going to have such a strong emotional reaction. So you begin to talk about what surprises did they run into. And you can, if you have time, you can say, how did that hit you? How did that affect you when all of a sudden there was that meltdown? What do you think led to that? Surprise is whatever things they were not anticipating, but that still affected the whole thing. Describe, role, expectation, success, surprise, change. That's what would you do differently? If you could go back and talk to yourself a month before the board meeting, is there anything you would give yourself a heads up on? Don't forget this, or make sure you double check on the venue, or whatever things you feel like. That's basically the end of an after action report. Up to that point, describe, role, expectation, success, surprise, change is basically an after action report. It's looking at the thing itself of what went well, what were your responsibilities, and now finally ending up with what would you do differently. And that's of value just in and of itself. Your primary goal in development as a leader in an organization is that you develop people to be able to do their job well. What's been asked of them, and if they can get smarter, wiser, more faithful in the task they've been given, everybody wins. They feel good about themselves. You're glad they're in that role, etc. The after-action report part of dress codes is a powerful developmental tool, because it just helps them think. And by having this conversation, it sets them up to remember next time, yep, I remember from last time, I really need to pay more attention to this thing or that thing. Now, at this point, dress codes shifts. So you've got your describe, role, expectation, success, surprise, change, and that's focusing on the activities, the planning, the leading itself. At this point, there's a developmental shift. When you go to the O of observation, you want to shift their attention from the activity itself to themselves as a person. Because every major thing a person goes through, particularly if it's something they're leading, there are things that come out of them as a result of being in that situation. Maybe because of the stress, the responsibility, the accountability, the visibility. And so the observation question is, what did you observe about yourself as you did that? It might have been their first time to lead a conference. What did you observe about yourself as you led that conference? I realized I'm pretty good at this part, but I'm horrible at this part. Or I realized that it's hard for me to truly be collaborative. I realize I'm a little bit more of an independent producer than I thought. And so the result of that is I don't communicate really well and clearly and in a timely way. But you're asking them, step outside yourself and watch yourself go through this period of time or this activity. What do you see in yourself in terms of strengths, weakness, whatever? I'm not looking for anything either positive or negative. This is the most powerful self-awareness question of the whole thing. A lot of times people don't even think about this. They're just thinking about the thing. Did it go well? Did it not go well? What would I do differently? But to ask the question, what did you observe about yourself? They probably didn't observe anything unless they stop and think about it. Even if it's through the eyes of others who complained. They say, well, I didn't observe it about myself, but I got a lot of negative feedback on this particular point or that point. And so maybe I am observing that about myself through their eyes. So that's a wonderful question there. What did you observe about yourself in your first year as a team leader, or in your first 6 months on the field, or during your time of sabbatical back in the U.S.? Each of these things brings out things in a person that if they can pay attention to that, and particularly, let's face it, men are not that self-aware.
Yeah.
So particularly with men, I think being there and walking with them as they try to become more aware of themselves, their emotions, and how they come across, stewarding their influence, is a powerful thing. So that's observation. Now you move to see, is there any way you can capitalize on those observations, both in terms of what they would do differently in terms of the events and also what they've observed about themselves. So the next point is develop. What would be your next steps of growth and development, given what as you've reflected on the activity and on yourself? Is there any things for your own growth and development that you'd like to identify and possibly give some focus to? And they say, well, I could learn more about delegation, or I realize I'm not as aware of how I come across, or I need to be more clear in terms of my communication, or et cetera. So that's where you kind of explore different developmental options and try to help them identify, out of all of those, what would be the most significant thing to work on now. Is there any of those that you'd like to work on now? So that's the develop question. Then execution it's still a cloud. They've identified, well, I need to work on communication or connecting, et cetera. But if we don't actually do anything about it, it's stillborn. So what would help you take the next steps in that area if you'd like to? Is there someone you could talk to about that? Is there someone that you feel knows more about that than you do? Are you familiar with any kind of literature, books, courses that you think would be helpful? So again, you're not trying to answer that question for them. You're exploring with them with what they already have and know, if they can identify a next step. Now, I want you to notice with what we've covered so far, that's 9 questions. The last one is just, can I share a thought? So, I mean, that's your one chance to bring up something. By that time, as a leader developer, you probably have an observation or a suggestion. And the whole point of that is to try to keep you from chiming in or pulling it onto yourself or becoming the savior. You're trying to keep them in the driver's seat. It's highly respectful of their experience, their wisdom. They're not brand new at this. And you want to give them as much space and support possible to come up with their own observations and applications. Most people also really appreciate a timely word there at the end, because they also want to know, what do you see? And so being able to do some affirmation at that point, and possibly affirmation of what they've come up with in terms of development and how they want to go about that, maybe a suggestion. Well, I've really found the book, The 4 Disciplines of Execution, really helpful on this particular point, or whatever it might be. So you'll see overall, there are 2 parts to dress codes. There's the after action report of describe, role, expectation, success, surprise, change. And then there's more the self-awareness and personal growth part of observation, development, execution, share.
I was sitting and thinking as you were going through that, Henry, about Just the value. I appreciate you end with share and what you mentioned about affirmation as well. Certainly, it's an opportunity to share anything we think they missed that's important to bring up. But boy, does that need to be what I would say kind of like a praise sandwich. It's an opportunity to cover their vulnerability as they have gone through and shared things that they may feel like exposed at that point. And so to be able to affirm them, I think we all need that more than we realize.
Yeah.
The people we're leading need it more than we realize, to the affirmation of what they did right and to cover that vulnerability.
Yeah.
And I think that is a step in the direction of setting a culture for being able to have further developmental conversations. If they walked away feeling affirmed after this one, yes, learned, maybe they see some things they need to change, but just the affirmation there. And I think, to me, the culture, having a culture where this is just normal is so important. Otherwise, it could be really awkward. Let me sit down and have a conversation. Uh-oh, I messed up.
Yep.
But to say, I think periodically, one of the things that we've had come up on this podcast over and over again is one of the best things you can do as a leader is go first and to invite people to guide you through a dress code's developmental conversation. Allow them to be the question asker. Just shows you're willing to be vulnerable. You realize you need to grow and develop, and just make it standard operating procedure. It's so much easier. I think about this organization that does fun runs to raise money at schools, usually elementary schools. And it has some really great leadership. There's a guy named Chris Carneal who leads that, and they built it into their culture. After every event, there's a circle up, let's talk about how it went and all, and nobody feels like they're being picked on. It's just a part of it, and they continue to get better and better because they have this developmental culture. And so I'm seeing this as a real helpful tool that could be a part of that culture, but would be more challenging without spending the time and being vulnerable yourself to develop the culture.
Yeah. And what's nice about the dress code's questions is anybody can ask these questions. I mean, it's just, you don't have to know that much.
Yeah.
It would be such a simple thing to say, why don't we try this out? And why don't you do it with me, whatever I led, and let them try it out first from the question asker standpoint. And then say, in general, we feel like this whole concept of developmental dialogue would be a powerful step forward in creating a more developmental culture.
I like that.
I think that's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah, and it is something that I have found is so easy to use and adopt. I remember the first time I got exposure to it, and it was through an LDC training, and we came away with these little like postcards of 4x6, and I just kept it with in my briefcase, and I was sitting in a Starbucks with someone I oversaw their leader, and they were down, but I would get with everybody in our community about once every 6 weeks just to check in and see how they're doing. And they were talking about a situation that was coming up, and I'm like, oh, this will be a great time to use dress codes. But I didn't have it memorized. I said, do you mind? I have something I've just learned, and I'd love to, I think it would help right now. Do you mind if I just grab it real quick and it guides
That's
me?
great.
And they're like, sure. And so I didn't have to have it memorized. I pulled out the card and just had it right there in front of me in the coffee table, and I would look at it and ask a question. She would talk, and I would go to the next question. After I did that 4 or 5 times with different people, I didn't need the card anymore. It is very easy. Once you understand it and get to using it a few times, anybody can use it.
Yeah. We'll put a link in the show description that will help you find that tool.
Yeah.
I have a book on it that's on Amazon.
That's great. We'll put a link to that in the description.
Yeah. So, Henry, I have a question. In today's world, it seems like the younger generation, technology, data, doing things through Signal, WhatsApp, texting, TikTok, whatever. How important is it for leaders to cultivate human skills like empathy, trust, and intuition? It seems like technology is getting in the way of some of that. Mm-hmm. What would you encourage people to do to help that, so that when they have an opportunity to use something like a dress code, that they're able to have the person be open to them, and it be something that's reinforcing versus, like Bob might have said earlier, oh, I'm in trouble, they want to talk to me. How do you work with that?
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic with all the benefits and things that technology makes easier. There are certain natural drawbacks to it because technology occupies a space that humans used to occupy. And so the things that are uniquely human are pushed out. And because people are unavoidably continue to be humans, it's not as though we can evolve truly into being machines. And so we still have the same deep needs and wants and also fears and insecurities. Asking questions can be good, and it could also be very threatening. And any tool, a sharp knife, can be a wonderful blessing, or it can be a preliminary to a crime. It's neither good nor bad. It's how it's used. So I would say dress codes is the same. It's predicated on a growing level of trust, mutual respect. I think Bob's idea, for example, the mutuality of you do it with me, I'll do it with you. Let's just give it a try. Let's play with it and see what kind of benefit we see. Where more and more you demonstrate to the person that this is a safe space. With the leader development program of the Navigators, there are two words that we want to hold on to firmly as we do our leader development. One is safety, and the other is rigor. We want this to be a place where you feel safe, you feel loved, respected, but also a place where you're pushed and stretched and sometimes made uncomfortable. Safety doesn't necessarily mean always comfortable, because people only grow when they are challenged and stretched. That's where you're trying to hit that balance with dress codes also.
Thanks for sharing. Bob, you mentioned, as the leader, go first. What other things have you seen work to help develop trust or empathy with leaders and the people that they try to develop?
Yeah, I think going first, but then, as I said before, making sure that you do call out the good that you saw. And I think that builds trust when they can see that. And I think the other thing, too, is when you have something to say it forthrightly. Don't necessarily don't have an agenda. I'm going to hide behind this process. I really want to say something, but I'm going to use this process. I think if you really have something you feel like it's important to say clearly to the person, then just be kind and say it. But I think people can sniff out, he or she has an agenda here. They're really not just going through this with no agenda. And so I think just being forthright, people appreciate that authenticity rather than I'm going to try to beat around the bush and use questions to get the point that I really want to make.
Yeah.
One of the challenges a lot of times leaders have in being developmental is figuring out, particularly with peak performers, nothing comes to mind in terms of what they need to grow and develop in. Everyone could grow and develop in everything. So it's not enough to say, what do they need development in? You're going to have to make some kind of a selection. And another big benefit of dress codes is when you don't know what to develop someone in, particularly if they're a peak performer, you lead them through dress codes and you may discover what would be the best next step in their growth and development. You don't have to have any answers when you start off with dress codes. All you have to have is an experience you're going to evaluate. But the fruit that might come out of that is your next developmental targets for them.
Yeah. And I think the value of that is when they can help identify the developmental area is personal ownership. And most growth happens when we personally own the need to grow in that area. And so I think that's one of the strengths of being able to ask questions and let the individual themselves surface the area.
Yeah. A minute ago, Bob, you were talking about coming in with an agenda and how that's not helpful. Henry, what approaches have you seen or situations or contexts where maybe dress codes isn't the right time to use it or the right tool, or maybe somebody used it and it was harmful?
I did present it to one leader, and I'd always had such good experience with dress codes. I hadn't really thought about, do I need to make any safety observations? And I talked to one of his direct reports a few days later, and he said, that was horrible. I hope he never does that again. I said, what did he do? And he said, I don't know. We sat down, and he just shoved this piece of paper over to me and said, answer these questions. And I just felt so threatened. I thought, oh, brother. So anyway, I realized that not everyone has the soft skills to immediately apply dress codes. And if you have any sense that a person is not strong in know and connect, giving them some good examples of how to initiate this at the beginning. I mean, once people are into it and have seen the benefit and feel safe, obviously it goes wonderfully. But when someone is just beginning, it's better to give some good guidelines and remind them that questions can be perceived as threatening and as an interrogation. It's a dialogue. It's supposed to be highly respectful. There was a book written by Shine called Humble Inquiry. If you're the boss, you're threatening just by being there.
Right.
And so it's not as though you did anything particularly wrong. They're reacting in natural fear to someone they look to for employment. And you just have to take into account, I have to deconstruct their natural defensiveness with their employer if we're going to establish a growth environment. If everyone is putting all their energy into defense, they won't have any money left over for growth. And so the more we can create the environment that we're all wanting to learn and grow, I realize sometimes that can make us all feel a little bit vulnerable, me as the leader as well. I have my own insecurities. But why don't we covenant together? Let's try to advance in being more developmental as an organization. I'm personally committed to our own growth and development, and also to speaking truth with one another, speaking truth in love.
Yeah.
Henry, I'm sitting here thinking about using dress codes with a team of people. We've been talking a lot about doing it with an individual, but I'm wondering if you would make any modifications if a team sat down and said, let's debrief together an event that we just did. How might you change it, or would it just be the same?
We've seen it work effectively. Again, you have to think, well, how much time do we have with a team? It could go on for hours.
Yeah.
You have to decide what kind of a commitment do we want to make with it. But actually, you can use all the questions just as they are. On observation, it would be more like, what did we observe? What did you observe about the team's function as we went through this? So you just broaden it. And what are the areas of growth? I mean, obviously, you could tell them. Obviously, we could also go into each one of you through this thing. But let's keep it a discussion at a team level to see what we learn as a team about what we did, what that tells us about ourselves, and how we could grow and develop. So actually, we've done it a couple of times with the whole team over an event, and also found it very effective, having a amanuensis who'll take notes and stuff. But it's quite a rich discussion.
Yeah.
Because you really get to hear from everybody on all those things. And it's, wow, that is amazing. Because there are a lot of things you missed. You didn't see that. And they'll bring it up.
Yeah. Henry, any success stories, one or two, of just how dress codes impacted someone?
What I notice is most people don't have anybody that actually listens to them. This is something I would recommend for missions committees. If they have a missionary come back, just to sit with them for an hour and ask these questions. Most missionaries don't feel like anybody ever really asked and listened. They'll just say, how did it go? Oh, pretty good. Okay, let's move on. And so the gift of asking good questions in a safe environment just because you're interested, a humble inquiry, is quite a powerful value.
Yeah. Right. Henry, as we move towards the end here, let me ask you a question. Looking back on your 4 decades of experience, what's a core truth about leader development that has remained constant despite all these changes that have happened in, I think you said 47 years, so I mean almost 5 decades? Like, a lot of things have changed. What's something that stayed in place and kind of a core truth for you when it comes to leader development?
Like I said, my strength is developed, and so I'm a teacher, trainer, love bringing truth to life. That's the name of my podcast. And I had plenty of things to say on how to have a quiet time or discipleship, evangelism, marriage, parenting, dating, even some on finances. But I never had something clear and compelling on leadership. I just had a big bag of stuff, vision and setting the pace, et cetera, et cetera. And after 30 years, I sort of despaired that maybe there just isn't anything all that clear from the scripture in terms of leadership. And so it's been such an amazing new development in my last 20 years of my life, learning the lead, develop, care model, which comes out of the shepherd model in the scripture. And that is just such a foundational box top of what are the primary responsibilities of a leader. The main metaphor in the scripture that helps guide a leader in what they ought to do is the shepherd model, not the servant model. The servant model is the motive and the character behind it. But the servant model is for all of life and all Christians in all activities. So the shepherd model is so specific and enlightening. And the true value add of the shepherd model, the lead, develop, care, is that develop portion. Particularly in the last 200 years, leaders have become less developmental because they rely on institutions to take care of that. That's becoming back more to the forefront, that every leader needs to lead with a developmental mindset. Realizing that's how God leads, that's how Jesus leads. It's a fascinating study through the scripture. One of the biggest things I feel like I've discovered about God is that he has chosen to be developmental. He didn't have to be. He could have had us come out of the womb like the angels. They were started off perfect and they've stayed that way. He didn't have to teach the angels anything. They're already, all the software is already loaded. We're born with nothing. We have absolutely nothing. Every single human being is a DIY project of God. And you think, wow, he certainly is choosing to do this the hard way, but it tells us something about the nature of God, that he not only leads and cares, which is obvious and wonderful, that he is unstoppably a developmental God. And if we're going to be like him and like Jesus in our leadership, we have to learn to be more intentionally developmental.
Yeah, that's really good. Henry, thank you for being here with us.
Great time together.
Yeah.
This has been an episode of the Field Leaders Podcast, a ministry of Missio Nexus and a part of the Missio Nexus Podcast Network. Leaders, we are here for you. We're here to help you learn, connect, grow, and collaborate. You are not alone. God bless.